Subcommittee on Federal Lands will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to consider a discussion draft of legislation entitled "The Fostering Opportunities to Restore Ecosystems Through Sound Tribal Stewardship Act," or the Forest Act, sponsored by Representative Hurd. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to participate in today's hearing from the dais: the gentle lady from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, and the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Hurd. Without objection, so ordered. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3, Parent O. Without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands will consider draft legislation that expands tribal participation in cross-boundary forest management. Offered by my colleague from Colorado, Representative Hurd, the Forest Act harnesses the profound knowledge and experience of tribes to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire and make forests more resilient to drought, insects, and disease. Much like the bipartisan Fix Our Forests Act, which overwhelmingly passed the House earlier this year, this discussion draft continues committee Republicans' efforts this Congress to advance innovative, collaborative solutions that increase the pace and scale of active forest management and empower non-federal partners. Catastrophic wildfires have burned an average of 7 million acres annually, destroyed countless homes and businesses, obliterated wildlife habitat, and most tragically resulted in fatalities of both civilians and wildland firefighters. Yet the federal response to this crisis has been woefully inadequate. For decades now, federal land managers have been preoccupied with promulgating misguided preservationist policies and fending off extreme environmentalist lawsuits. In the process, these agencies have lost sight of their most important responsibility: reducing wildfire risk through active forest management. Just take a look at the chart behind me. You've seen this chart before. It shows that as federal land management agencies stopped harvesting timber, there was a substantial increase in the acres burned in catastrophic wildfires. We know what needs to be done. There's broad scientific consensus that active management, including mechanical thinning and prescribed burning, can restore health to our forests and reduce the intensity and destructiveness of wildfires. Yet federal spending on suppression continues to soar while prudent management efforts remain mired in bureaucracy. The Forest Act offers a different path, one rooted in tribal partnerships, innovation, and leadership. That's why I'm supportive of provisions in the Forest Act that enhance good neighbor authority, a critical tool that has dramatically increased cross-boundary management work. My home state of Wisconsin is a leader in GNA, and I was proud to support fixes to this program through the Explore Act that allowed tribes to retain receipts from timber sales for further management work. A major barrier to forest restoration, especially in the West, is the disappearance of sawmill infrastructure. Since 2000, more than 1,500 sawmills have closed or drastically curtailed their operations. Near federal lands, the lack of reliable supply is consistently cited as a main driver of closures. Without a market for low-value and hazardous fuels material, critical forest management stall. This creates a vicious cycle where federal agencies struggle to manage their forests and supply enough timber to local mills. Those mills shut down, and federal land managers have an even harder time getting management work done with no place nearby to process hazardous fuels coming off the forest. The Forest Act tackles this problem head-on by directing the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to establish tribal sawmill demonstration projects aimed at processing salvaged timber and reducing hazardous fuels in our most fire-prone areas. The Forest Act accomplished this by offering 20-year stewardship contracts and adding the retention and expansion of sawmill infrastructure as a goal under stewardship contracting authorities. Modeled on a demonstration project with the Washoe tribe in California following the Calder fire, this provision has the potential to create tribal jobs, revitalize rural economies, and reduce wildfire risk on federal lands. I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us today and sharing their expertise. I look forward to the discussion ahead as we consider this thoughtful legislation and explore how we can work together to improve forest health, support tribal and rural economies, and address the wildfire crisis. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Neguse for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman. Thank you to our fellow committee members for joining us today. To our witnesses, look forward to your testimony. It's always good to be back in the subcommittee. I'm certainly looking forward to the debate regarding this particular bill that my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Hurd, has offered, the discussion draft, and I suspect that we'll have a very fulsome discussion of a number of the issues that the chairman described. Before we proceed, however, I just do have to address what I perceive as an elephant in the room. This is the first time that we've gathered since the markup that the full committee held a week ago. Now, that markup was extensive and a lot of rigorous debate that ensued over the course of 13 some odd hours. But in particular, what I'd like to address for the moment was the midnight land sale that two of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle successfully initiated during the course of that markup. And the reason why I bring it up today is because I believe that the Republican majority has regrettably set a new precedent for this subcommittee to follow into future years. Majorities come, majorities go. But I want to make very clear for the record that this new precedent is now the governing principle with respect to consideration of land transfers or land protections or land sales of this type. If the Republicans proceed with including that measure as it is currently in the reconciliation bill that the full House is likely to consider later this week. There is still time for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to pull back, to remove that particular measure, which I would take as a signal of good faith that in fact this precedent is not one the Republicans wish to implement and force the full contingent of committee members on both sides of the aisle to comply with into the future. What is this precedent I'm speaking of? Well, of course, all of us on this committee and the dais know this well. The two provisions in question from our colleagues from Utah and Nevada were introduced in the dead of night without having been subject to a legislative hearing before this committee, without having been subjected to a markup by the full committee, with no guidance or insight or recommendations or analysis from the land management agencies impacted, which of course is what typically happens in a legislative hearing. It's why we're all gathered today, because Mr. Hurd has introduced a bill as a discussion draft intended for us to all discuss and for us to weigh in with our views on the matter. No one is stating or demanding that a member have the full consent of each and every member of this committee or each and every member of their state delegation, member that represents the lands in question. But we are simply saying that at least as long as I have been here, that has been a protocol that, Mr. Chairman, your predecessors, with respect to subcommittee chairman of this subcommittee, and also the predecessors of the full committee have followed. It matters. And I just think it's regrettable, and I would urge a note of caution to my colleagues, with the exception of Mr. Hurd, whom I want to publicly commend for, and he can articulate his reasons for doing so, but for taking the vote that he did a week ago and noting for the benefit of this full committee that that's not the way that land sales, land transfers ought to be consummated. And so I would just, again, implore my colleague, the chairman, to take that into consideration before this reconciliation bill gets to the floor. Now, the last thing I will say on this note, and then of course we'll proceed with the more fulsome discussion regarding the gentleman from Colorado's bill, is we're now learning the details of this proposed land sale and the devastating impact it will have. We didn't have time during the hearing because it was at midnight when our colleagues introduced it. I'll read you this headline, Mr. Chairman, from the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Could a public lands deal amount to a water grab for Utah? end quote. I do not know how my Republican colleagues from Arizona can possibly defend their vote in favor of this particular land sale that was pushed into the reconciliation bill in the dead of night that would divert water from the state of Arizona. I am baffled as to how they would defend it. And I would urge my colleagues, pull this provision out of the reconciliation bill so we can get back to the regular order of this subcommittee. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. And does the ranking member of the full committee have an opening statement? I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly want to associate myself with what was just said so well by our ranking member, and I agree that with the exception of Mr. Hurd, every Republican on this committee has a lot of explaining to do about how they let that monstrosity into their bill and also what they're doing right now to make sure that it comes out. But Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for today's hearing and for Mr. Hurd doing the work on this discussion draft. I appreciate the witnesses being here to talk about something very important. I've had a privilege of working with many of the witnesses in developing the Tribal Self-Determination and Co-Management in Forestry Act, which I introduced last week. So we've been thinking along the same lines, Mr. Hurd, Mr. Chairman. And my bill is co-sponsored by the vice ranking member and all the ranking members on our side here in the committee. It recognizes that tribal nations have played a role in land management since time immemorial, and it seeks to implement tribal co-management plans under the Department of Interior, providing the Forest Service with additional authority to ensure tribes have a meaningful role in public land management decisions that impact their communities. I see this issue as a bipartisan opportunity in this committee and something that Democrats and Republicans should be able to work on together despite our other profound differences. And I appreciate that the majority has agreed to include my bill in an upcoming hearing. We hope to get on the agenda today, but I'm glad we'll be in an upcoming hearing to explore how expanding co-management authority for the Forest Service can empower tribes to manage lands in ways that reflect their communities, reduce wildfire risks, support restoration, and help ensure that tribes are true partners in the decision-making process. My bill will also improve opportunities for tribal stewardship at Interior by directing land management agencies to develop co-management plans and by encouraging culturally appropriate training for federal employees. These are broadly supported policy goals, and given the support that my legislation has from our witnesses today and others across Indian country, I remain hopeful that it'll have the support of this committee, the bipartisan support of this committee. Now, as to Mr. Hurd's bill before us, the Forests Act, it addresses several issues that are not new to this committee. One section that caught my attention was the provision to establish tribal prescribed burns and cultural burn demonstration projects, and I welcome his inclusion of that. Before Western settlers criminalized burning to maximize timber production, tribes burned landscapes to regenerate and sustain ecosystems for both ecological and cultural benefit. Today, many of the tribes in my district have been leaders in the effort to reinstate these practices, to clear out vegetation, release nutrients in the soil. These are essential things for many traditional foods and basket materials. And it's also essential to acknowledge that the public lands we have today were built on the dispossession of tribal lands. These public lands include tribal ancestral lands, sacred sites, traditional foods, cultural resources, and generations of history that remain deeply tied to them. The aim of the Forests Act, as I understand it, is an important step in recognizing that reality. And as this is a discussion draft, I look forward to working with the author and this committee to strengthen the bill, to reflect our shared priorities, and to support the effective stewardship of public lands. At the same time, it seems that many of my Republican colleagues seem to have a disconnect that we need to also talk about, a disconnect between their tribal forestry priorities and their broader approach to public lands. The reconciliation bill that they have advanced will sell off public lands for extractive industries. They refused to explain their justifications, rejected amendments to ensure that tribes were consulted first, and to prevent irreparable damage to sacred cultural sites and resources. President Trump also just released his skinny budget proposal, which guts funding for BIA and the Forest Service, including $617 million for programs that support tribal self-governance, and tribal communities under the BIA, and cutting $303 million from state, private, and tribal forestry at the Forest Service, all while firing thousands of federal agency employees, terminating agency field office leases, and blocking key funding. So I'm encouraged that we are talking about this issue today, that we have a discussion draft that parallels some of the priorities and values that I've put into my legislation that we'll also soon be considering. But if we're serious about doing right by Indian country, we've got to also address that broader disconnect. I look forward to the discussion today, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. We'll now move on to our first panel, which consists of members who are sponsoring today's legislation. I now recognize Representative Hurd for 5 minutes on this bill.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Neguse for holding this hearing on the discussion draft of my legislation, the Fostering Opportunities to Restore Ecosystems Through Sound Tribal Stewardship Act, also known as the Forest Act. I would also like to thank committee staff for their work on this vital piece of policy. As every Western member knows, proper forestry management is a necessity. It is not an option. And as chairman of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs, I am proud to carry this legislation. It amends the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act to allow tribes to conduct additional active management on adjacent fire-prone federal lands. It extends the Tribal and Alaska Natives Biomass Demonstration Project and creates a new Tribal and Alaska Native Biochar Demonstration Project. It authorizes tribal prescribed burn and cultural burn demonstration projects on federal land to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires and to improve active management. It amends the Tribal Forest Protection Act to ensure the federal government is responsive to tribes. This bill also creates a new demonstration project to establish new sawmill infrastructure on tribal lands, helping create jobs and improve infrastructure to process hazardous fuels from fire-prone federal lands. The bill expands stewardship and result contracting to incentivize the retention of wood processing infrastructure, including infrastructure managed by tribes. It makes technical corrections, allowing tribes to be full partners in Good Neighbor Authority. The bill expands the Wood for Life program to create new pilot projects in each region of the Forest Service. And lastly, this legislation requires a report to ensure parity in pay between federal and tribal firefighters. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' testimony today, and I look forward to moving this legislation through the committee process. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. We'll now move on to our second panel. Let me remind the witness that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I'll ask you to please complete your statement. I would like to introduce Mr. John Crockett, Deputy Chief of State, Private and Tribal Forestry at the United States Forest Service. Deputy Chief Crockett, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
All right, good morning, Chair Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to speak on the Forest Act. My name is John Crockett, and I serve as Deputy Chief for State, Private, and Tribal Forestry at the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service manages more than 193 million acres of national forest and grassland across the country. These lands include areas of deep cultural, historical, and ecological significance to many tribal nations. The Forest Act would designate certain Forest Service lands as Indian lands and would authorize new and expanded avenues for tribes to support forest management on federal lands, convert low-value forest biomass into wood products, and undertake tribal shared stewardship actions like prescribed and cultural burning. These provisions reflect a growing emphasis on tribal-led management and consideration of tribal ecological knowledge. We support this bill's proposed expansion of demonstration projects that use low-value forest biomass, produce biochar, as well as establish and or expand sawmills on or near National Forest System lands. These initiatives promote forest health by reducing hazardous fuels, contribute to local tribal economies, support innovation and sustainable forest products markets, and the emphasis on job creation, wildfire resiliency, and the work of the tribe greatly aligns with the Forest Service priorities. The Forest Act would also amend the Tribal Forest Protection Act, or TFPA, to authorize tribes to carry out prescribed and cultural burns under multi-use burn plans. We support this amendment as a means of enhancing tribal stewardship while improving the landscape resiliency. We look forward to working with the committee on how to expand liability protections, staffing needs, and that the tribal authority can be structured to ensure safety, clarity, and long-term success. We also welcome a discussion on extending the Federal Tort Claims Act to tribal employees who carry out prescribed and cultural burns or other activities authorized under TFPA. Several other provisions, including additional updates to TFPA and the expansion of stewardship contracting goals, also support critical restoration and economic development. While we support many sections of this bill, others raise legal and operational consideration that merit further discussion. Section 2, for example, would allow certain federal lands to be treated as Indian forest lands for the purpose of forest management and would convert Forest Service resources into tribal trust assets that are managed by approved plans through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. While we support tribal shared stewardship, we are concerned about converting Forest Service lands and resources to another legal designation and commingling tribal trust asset management within various departments. We also have questions related to the civil and criminal jurisdictions, overlapping tribal interests on the same landscape, and potential conflicts with existing Forest Service authorities. Finally, the Forest Service supports clarifying tribal eligibility under the Good Neighbor Authority and would welcome a discussion on the Tribal Wood for Life program that directly engage tribes to improve their communities' access to firewood and hazardous fuels projects. We appreciate the bill's aim to increase direct tribal participation and hope to work with the committee to ensure the bill's language achieves congressional intent. In closing, we are committed to continuing to work with this subcommittee and with tribes to improve forest health, advance shared stewardship goals, and honor the treaty and trust responsibilities of tribes. Provisions in the Forest Act present an important opportunity to deepen that commitment and support to tribal shared stewardship of federal lands. That concludes my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to share the Forest Service views, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chief Crockett. I'm now going to recognize members for 5 minutes, and I am going to begin questioning here. You heard in my opening statement the comments about the closure of sawmills, especially in the western part of the country. More than a third of the sawmills in the country have shut down over the past 25 years, in large part because of the lack of certainty that they were going to be able to get wood. We've been hearing that story, for example, from the Black Hills out in South Dakota. How has the reduction in sawmills affected the Forest Service ability to manage its forests, and how would the Forest Act help?
To push that talk button. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, the Forest Service cannot do our work if we don't have places to take the byproducts that come off of the Forest Service land. The bill, because it expands the ability for sawmills to tribes, that gives us another place to have our products, our restoration products go, and knowing that they're tribally supported mills is an added benefit.
So isn't it correct that without some long-term contracting being done, future investors are going to have a hard time justifying making an investment, aren't they?
Long-term viability and long-term access to a sustainable wood supply is something that we've heard from industry for a significant amount of time. 20-year stewardship contracting is a way of doing that. We also have other tools such as long-term sustained yield units that we've held in the past. And we know that when you implement a 20-year stewardship contract, the certainty can be there for industry to take that to the banks to be able to get the financial supply that they need. But there's a lot that can change over a 20-year period. And we recognize that structuring a 20-year contract in a way where you can do an reevaluation over that 20-year period is an important component of it.
So in the state of Wisconsin, we have a managed forest law program that has 25 and 50-year programs, works very effectively. Why couldn't that be done here also?
So that sounds like it's similar to the long-term sustained yield unit that I mentioned just then. So no objections to it happening in that way. What I would say is the Forest Service is interested in making sure that we are partnering with the industry to provide a long-term sustainable supply of wood.
The Forest Service enhances, or the Forest Act that you see before us enhances Good Neighbor Authority. The Fix Our Forests Act also included improvements to GNA, including the ability to construct new roads. It's my understanding the Senate version of the Fix Our Forests Act removed the provision to be able to construct new roads. How would allowing tribes to construct new roads under GNA improve forest health and fire suppression?
Yeah, so road access is a significant component of our ability to do a restoration treatment. If we don't have a way of getting it out of the woods, it can't get out of the woods. So to answer your question around the ability for revenue retention or roads to be built under the Good Neighbor Authority, that would be a benefit, not only to tribes, but to states and counties and others who access the Good Neighbor Authority.
So the Senate is wrong in trying to remove the constructing new roads provision.
I'm not here to pass judgment on the Senate, but what I will say is the ability to tap into roads for Good Neighbor Authority is a plus.
I was too obvious with my question, wasn't I? I have to be much more subtle. You mentioned that there's, it sounds like you have a few concerns from a legal standpoint in terms of jurisdiction with the bill before us. Is that accurate?
That was one section. Section 2, we want to work with the committee on the legal jurisdictions of tribe or lands being transferred to the BIA, and then commingling those responsibilities for managing it long-term.
I yield back. Thank you for answering those questions. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes. I will recognize the ranking member, Mr. Huffman, for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. As we're going to hear from the next panel, tribal co-management on public lands is a top priority for many tribal nations across the nation. I hear about it from many of them, and it raises important questions about how the federal government can better engage with tribes as true partners in land stewardship. Of course, at a minimum, that starts with being fully committed to meaningful consultation and upholding federal trust responsibilities when it comes to managing lands. And, you know, it would make no sense to enter into some contracts for a tribe to build a mill or cut some trees, but then separately greenlight a mining project that would pollute their water or desecrate their sacred sites. And so, Mr. Deputy Chief, I just want to ask you if this administration is truly committed to protecting sacred sites and preserving cultural resources on our public lands, and if so, how is the Forest Service working to honor that commitment?
Thank you for the question. So the Forest Service honors that commitment by making sure that we provide opportunities for tribal consultation. And I would say meaningful consultation with tribes on any of the projects that we would implement. And at the same time, the Forest Service has a multiple use mission. And that multiple use mission includes the opportunity for extractive opportunities through mining and timber, and as long as the water resources are protected.
Have you reviewed the Republican reconciliation bill that was marked up in this committee a couple of weeks ago?
I have not had the opportunity to review that bill.
Well, sir, I suggest that you do, because it stands at odds with what you just said. There are several authorities in there where tribal consultation is simply missing on critical projects that could profoundly impact tribes. And I would think that if you were true to that commitment of upholding your trust responsibility and having meaningful consultation, you would want to offer some very critical feedback of that legislation before it gets too far down the road. Can you speak to the limitations that the Forest Service has in carrying out co-stewardship and co-management agreements, and whether there are some additional legal authorities or resources that you might need to do that?
So I don't have a list of limitations that come to mind. I do know over the past several years, we've had several opportunities to expand our tribal co-stewardship work with tribes. We invested significant amounts of funding to be able to do that work, and generated a lot of interest from tribes in setting up co-stewardship projects.
All right. I want to ask about the concerns that many of us have about these budget cuts and workforce actions that are severely undermining core capacities across a number of federal agencies. But in your agency, sir, tribal relations specialists were reportedly among those terminated in mass layoffs. These specialists play a key role in spotlighting tribal priorities and ensuring that tribal perspectives are integrated across the agency's work. It seems to me that those are essential positions if we're going to be serious about tribal co-management and self-determination and the things that we're talking about here today. So I want to ask if any of these positions have been reinstated or filled, and if not, how does the Forest Service intend to restore them, or will they simply be left vacant?
So in our tribal organization, we didn't have any terminations of tribal positions. We did have some individuals who took the voluntary opportunities and departed the agency, but we still have an Office of Tribal Relations, and we're still planning to uphold their trust responsibilities and not diminish tribal sovereignty.
Okay, in the time I have left, while I have you, I met with the chief last week, and he explained that we've been expressing concerns about a lot of the departures of fire support personnel as we head into fire season. And he explained that some new financial incentives have been put in place to try to temporarily bring some of those people back out of retirement to get us through this next fire season. Have you done any analysis of how much that's going to cost, what the uptake is going to be by these folks who in some cases have surely moved on and gotten other jobs? What can you tell us about whether that is going to solve the problem as we head into fire season?
Yeah, so we did do an evaluation of employees who have left the agency. I will say we had certain exemptions, and fire was one of the category of employees who were exempted, which means that we asked them to stay on in their position. But for those employees that left, we're analyzing what the impacts of that departure will be, but we don't have the final results of that just yet.
So you don't have the price tag for luring them back, and you don't have an estimate of how many would actually take that deal and come back to get us through fire season?
We don't.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Benz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Deputy Chief Crockett, I missed your opening statement, so forgive me for perhaps asking you to cover stuff you've already talked about. But what is your thought on who would or how you would coordinate with the tribes under this proposed bill? In other words, I guess the relationships that are necessary. What would you see? How would you ask us to call out your responsibility vis-a-vis a tribe when a tribe is given this management opportunity?
So thank you for the question. So anytime we have the opportunity to have the tribal voice at the table is a beneficial one. Some of the complications that I named in my opening statement around the bill, because we're having lands that transfer from the Forest Service to the BIA for the trust responsibility that's associated with it, that there are some concerns that we wanted to work with the committee on how to adjudicate those that language. But to your question around the tribal voice, like we welcome that at the table to help us enhance our work.
I'm sure you do, but the challenge is who's in charge. That's a challenge, isn't it, when it comes to who's managing these lands? If you're going to turn management over to the tribe, how would you want that memorialized? Would you want a contract? Would you want an agreement? Would you want a statute? What is it that you need in order to understand where you stand vis-a-vis the tribe in one of these arrangements?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that the transfer goes to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then the Bureau of Indian Affairs would then manage those lands in trust for the tribes. So as long as we had an opportunity to be able to work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs on what that transfer would look like and then how it would be managed beyond that, I think that's where we'd find some opportunities for success.
I mean, let's back up for a second. I had not read the bill that closely to understand that there would be a transfer. A transfer of what, title? Or transfer of management? It's still the federal government that owns it. So share with me how you see the BIA working with you, if at all, after this transfer.
So I don't know all the full details of the technicalities of what happens after it's transferred, but sharing my understanding of when it's transferred to BIA, they become the landowner, if you will, and tribes have a voice into how the management of those tribal assets would happen. It's my understanding the Forest Service, we wouldn't be completely out of the picture at that point, but BIA would then have the lead on management of the lands.
The challenge is, of course, isn't it, that these lands are owned by all of us. And so managing in them is another issue entirely. And I think all of us would agree that finding some way to do a better job of managing is a really, really, really good idea. And before I just gloss over that, do you agree that this is an opportunity to improve the land? That this bill provides us a foundation to perhaps get off of this where we are now, which seems to be locked down and not being able to manage the land appropriately? Does this bill move us in the right direction is probably the
So the short answer is yes. And tribes have an amazing history and traditional ecological knowledge and expertise that they would bring to the table in land management.
But this is not a transfer of ownership as such. This is a transfer of management. That is, the land itself still remains the property of the people of the United States, and what we have is another group who has a historical interest in treating the land well, now, quote, managing it, not owning it. That's where I'm trying to go with this question. Okay. Do you see it as moving in the wrong direction when it comes to actual control and taking stuff off the land to the benefit of some group, the tribe, as opposed to the people of the United States, or do you see it as more of a management arrangement?
So the management opportunity is a beneficial one, whether it's the Forest Service managing it or the tribal expertise helping to management. At the end of the day, as long as the landscapes are healthy, resilient to fire and insect and disease risk, that's the win.
Well, I look forward to working on this further because I think it's a great opportunity for all of us. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Chief Crockett, for your testimony. I promise I'll get to the substance of why we're here in the bill eventually here, but I wanted to ask you, since you're here, just a few questions about an issue that's deeply important to folks I represent back in Colorado. There are, as you probably are aware, 3 congressionally designated Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes that work to understand and reduce the threat of wildfire and receive funding from the Forest Service. One of those institutes, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, is located in my district, based at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. These institutes have been supported on a bipartisan basis by Congress. We designated funding upwards of $6.6 million for fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25. We've recently learned that the Forest Service has told the institutes that their funding will be cut in half for fiscal year 2025, reducing funding to $3 million for all 3 institutes. That would represent a 55% reduction in federal funding and put critical science-based work that takes place at each of these centers into jeopardy. Deputy Chief, are you aware of this? Question number 1. And the second question is, I suppose if you are aware, is the Forest Service intending to reallocate funds designated for these institutes?
Thank you for the question. So to answer the first question, yes, I'm aware of the budget adjustments that we made. And I actually have a working session set up with the leaders of the institutes tomorrow to work through the details of looking at the existing funding that's on the books that they've had for several years, as well as the opportunities with the $3 million that was allocated this year, knowing that there's another institute in Utah that is set to come online next year. Plan to have a budget working session with them tomorrow on that topic.
Well, I would just suggest to you, Deputy Chief, thank you for your candor. Congress appropriated the funds, right?
Yes.
Right, so the United States Congress appropriated to your department, your parent agency, this particular sum of money to be expended by these institutes. And I I don't understand the Forest Service's position that it can and is proceeding to reallocate, I think the word you used was adjustment, make adjustments notwithstanding congressional intent, which was very clear in the appropriations that we've adopted. And you could imagine the slippery slope that will create here in Congress, because essentially, I don't know how much clearer we could be, and the appropriators could be. And I suppose that it will compel Republican and Democratic members of Congress to work together to provide your agency and other agencies like it with no discretion whatsoever, given the lack of clarity as to the agency's willingness to implement the appropriations as they have been designated by Congress. So I would just encourage you, we will certainly follow up with the agency and with the chief, but would hope that you could relay the same back to the relevant decision makers within the agency. Of course, you are one of them, because I would hope that the agency's final decision would be to abide by the congressional intent in the fiscal year 2025 appropriation. With respect to the bill that we're discussing today, and I think there are a number of different components that my colleague from Colorado has included in his discussion draft that make sense and I think are prudent. There are other areas where I have some questions and look forward to collaborating and engaging on some of those questions, some of which were noted by the ranking member of the full committee. The only, I guess, observation I would make, and you're welcome to respond, Deputy Chief, is that while I think enacting new authorities, reforming existing authorities is certainly worth doing, I worry that we're missing the forest for the trees, pardon the pun, because this is all happening in the context of a skinny budget that the Trump administration has submitted that decimates the Forest Service, decimates the BIA. It's unclear to me, how the BIA would begin to even achieve some of what we would be asking them to do under the skinny budget submitted by the president. But in any event, if you wish to respond, you're welcome to.
So I don't know if I have a full answer for you, but just say that, the administration supports the president's budget, and we're looking forward to working through successful solutions.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
His time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Tiffany and Ranking Member Neguse. Deputy Chief Crockett, thank you for joining us today. As I anticipate we'll hear this morning, proper forest management is a collaborative effort, and it's necessary to include tribes, along with state and local governments and private individuals and entities in our forest management practices. As you note in your testimony, the Forest Service has 193 million acres of forest and grasslands under its management. Without partnerships with the tribes, along with state, local, and private entities, could the Forest Service properly manage these lands?
So the way I'll answer that question is the Forest Service looks for opportunities with tribes as well as other entities to help partner on the management of those lands. And so, as I mentioned earlier, tribes have a significant ecological knowledge that is beneficial for us in the management of it, and we welcome their voice at the table in helping us with future opportunities for them.
And Deputy Chief Crockett, this legislation gives you the opportunities fully to work with our tribes, and I think it's a really, really good opportunity. So while funding for the Forest Service and other land managers has increased in recent years thanks to historic investments by Congress in the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the deferred maintenance backlog for our federal land managers continues to grow year after year. This shows that increased funding is not just the answer, it's much larger than that. Deputy Chief Crockett, how can the Forest Service utilize tribes and other partners better for proper forest management, and what is holding the service back from further utilizing these partnerships?
So I don't I don't think there's anything that's holding us back from engaging with tribes. The work that tribal leaders do on their lands is impressive, and we look forward to bringing that perspective into the work that we do on our federal lands.
So, so what's holding you up from working even better? Obviously, this legislation allows the work and the cooperation to even be better. What's, irregardless of this legislation, what was or what has been holding you up?
So I don't think there's anything that's holding us up. There are opportunities through various bills that gives us a better window in how to partner and collaborate with tribes. I think this bill does just that. It provides new windows through Good Neighbor Authority, through stewardship contracting, through retention of sawmills. But I wouldn't say anything is holding us up from engaging with tribes.
You had mentioned that as a crucial piece of legislation, and the sawmill investments on tribal lands. I think that's a huge opportunity. So it is safe to say that the expanded authorities in this bill would permit the Forest Service to better collaborate and partner with tribes, lessening the burden on your agency?
Yes.
So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that currently, or at least the start of last week, we had 3 major forest fires in northern Minnesota. It'll never happen again in my lifetime. Yeah. And I am very proud of the U.S. Forest Service and their wildland firefighting. Excellent job, night and day. And obviously the first priority is life safety. And as of yet, I haven't heard of any loss of life, which is huge. And I give credit to our local volunteer fire departments, local community members, and local restaurants and bars, and the U.S. Forest Service for providing that. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Now recognize Ms. Randall for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. It goes without saying that tribal consultation should be first and foremost in any discussion about land management, and I think we've heard shades of that position from all of my colleagues here today. In Washington's 6th district, there are 12 federally recognized tribes that have called this land home since long before it was the United States. The tribes in my district have protected the health of our forests and kept their communities safe from the fire risks for time immemorial. Meaningful consultation with tribes is not only a recognition of this deep knowledge of the lands, it is our legal obligation. And tribal consultation must start early and continue to be an open conversation, not just a box that we check to move on to the next item of our agenda. In this time when tribal treaty rights are under attack, we must hold up our end of the deal, which means providing the necessary resources to meet our trust and treaty obligations to ensure tribes can effectively co-manage this land. Mr. Crockett, I so appreciate you taking the time to be here and answer our questions. As we've discussed today, the draft bill would authorize certain federal forest lands to be treated as Indian forest lands if they meet certain criteria. And my first question is, how would the Forest Service determine whether federal forest lands are historically, culturally, or economically important to a tribe seeking an agreement with the agency under Section 2?
So thank you for that question. I think that's probably the most complicated part of the bill. If you take 10 acres of land and look at the history of it, the cultural, the historic, and geographical history of it, there are many overlapping tribal, the boundaries of tribes overlap over time. And so Section 2 of the bill puts the Forest Service in the place of having to be the arbiter of that important geographical and complex history. And so I would say that's probably the most complicated part of it, and we would look forward to working with the committee to, on the details of it.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose sort of a follow-up, which you dipped your toe into in that answer, when there are multiple tribes that have claims to the same geographic area, do you have any, I don't know, perspective on steps that we should be taking to proceed as, you know, we are acting as the arbiters of that situation. I know it's a difficult position that I think many members of Congress worry about getting involved in too. So would love any thoughts that you have at this point, but also to continue this conversation about how we do that work.
Yeah, so I don't have a perfect answer on how to get to yes or the right answer on that. I think the tribal voice, the BIA's voice, the Forest Service voice are all ways that we can work with the committee to find some successful solutions. So I look forward to following up to do that.
Thank you. And in your experience, have there been any impacts of recent staff shortages or grant cancellations on tribal stewardship of federal lands?
Not to my knowledge. I don't have the full landscape of all of the grants and agreements in the agency, but I'm not aware of any tribal grants, contracts, and/or agreements that have been canceled.
Okay. Well, certainly want to continue to keep an eye on that as we move through reconciliation and the impacts of the skinny budget that this president has proposed. I think, one of the things that that we've seen in other agencies is, well, maybe there aren't cuts to a particular program, the elimination of some administrative staff have an impact on the ability for an agency to carry out their work as a sort of customer service, for the folks who are receiving support from the agency. So something we'll definitely continue to track. Thank you so much for being here, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady from Washington yields, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Hurd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany. Deputy Chief Crockett, thank you very much again for your testimony this morning. One of the things that you mentioned in your testimony is some concern about Section 2 and the jurisdictional issues. I was looking through the statute itself, and Section 2, subsection C, subsection 3 explicitly says, and this kind of gets to Congressman Bence's question as well, the legislation is drafted explicitly says that treating federal land as Indian trust land, Indian forest land, does not redesignate that land for any other purpose, including jurisdiction. Are you reading any provision of the bill as changing the jurisdictional status of the land, for example, transferring title or shifting criminal jurisdiction?
So maybe I misspoke earlier when I was referencing the transfer of lands to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I had a hearing a couple of weeks ago, and maybe that was the one that was coming in. But based on what you just shared, I think that's the most accurate language in the bill.
Okay. One other thing, thank you for that. One other thing your testimony mentions is the commingling of Interior's trustee obligations with the USDA and Forest Service authorities. Can you think of any specific legal risks that this bill might create for the Forest Service, and whether those risks or concerns might be addressed through technical clarifications?
Yes, so there are legal risks. I have to follow up with our Office of General Counsel on the specific legal risks, but in conversations that I've had with them, they've talked about it in general. And yes, we look forward to working with the committee to name what those risks are and find a path forward on it.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Chief. Can you talk to me a little bit about the practical concerns about overlapping authority or coordination, especially during active forest management activities or emergencies like wildfires?
Okay, if you wouldn't mind, say a little bit more.
Sure. What, from your perspective, what concerns would you have about potential overlapping authority or jurisdiction when it comes to active forest management activities or emergencies like wildfires?
So as it stands, if a fire happens on Forest Service lands, we know what our jurisdictional responsibilities are with that. If the management is transferred, I don't think the bill speaks specifically to the other statutory requirements. I think it names specifically the timber assets that they would be in turn treated in such ways that are anchored to the tribal forest management plan. But I don't think the bill spoke specifically to other statutes such as wildfire management.
I'm just trying to think of how we might address some of the concerns, which I really appreciate you bringing forward as well. And I'm wondering, just off the top of my head, if there are any concerns that we might be able to address those through interagency agreements or planning coordination or something like that. I assume that would be possible.
Yeah, it would be no different than what we would do in any pre-season engagement with other land management organizations.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Deputy Chief Crockett. I appreciate it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. And I now recognize the gentlelady from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you here, Mr. Crockett. I want to start by just saying thank you to Representative Hurd for bringing this legislation in preparation for this hearing. We did send it to some of the tribal nations in New Mexico, and obviously because we share a border and a number of forests, we also have a number of tribes for whom these forests are their historic and current homelands. And there's certainly a lot in this bill that our tribes are very supportive of, including forest health tools, infrastructure, hazardous fuel reduction. But we'd love to work with the sponsor to try to improve some of the technical language that protects tribal sovereignty and some of the legal issues that Mr. Crockett outlined. But do appreciate that and also support Mr. Huffman. And I'm grateful for the bipartisan effort to address this. New Mexico is home to 23 sovereign tribes and nations. And for our tribes, they have lived on these lands since time immemorial. And in my district, in New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, which is central New Mexico, including 10 rural counties, we have a lot of different Forest Service districts and a lot of different national forests and tribal forests, including in southern New Mexico, we have the Lincoln County Forest, and this is the Sierra Blanca, which is the mountain in southern New Mexico. And it also is the homeland of the Mescalero Apache people. And not only have the Mescalero people have been managing forests and fire itself for generations, our Mescalero tribe has also been the birthplace that raised some great foresters, including the current president, who is a forester, President Padilla, and the former Undersecretary for Natural Resources, Butch Blazer, who is also a member of the tribe and a former president. So we're proud of the forest stewardship and the leadership nationally that comes out of our tribal communities, and excited to work on a bipartisan basis to bring more resources and more tools to our tribes to manage their historic lands. And so, Deputy, I'd love to ask, I know this has been asked in some different forms here today, but you've been at this game for a long time. What do you see as some of the ways in which Congress can help support better co-management working with our tribes and federal lands?
Thank you for the question. So I would actually start with making sure the tribal voice is brought into the conversation. So you mentioned sharing the bill with your members, and they had a perspective on it. I feel like that's where we start, because their perspective helps to shape a bill that can actually be implemented. Obviously, we're going to have a federal perspective on it anytime a bill comes forward. But I would start with what you're already doing and bringing in that tribal voice and the tribal perspective on it.
And are there other things that you've seen during your time in this role that would help support tribes more directly in terms of that partnership?
I think continued engagement around co-management and co-stewardship. We've seen a significant amount of increase from tribes and through the number of co-stewardship projects, whether it be in fire management or fuels management or salmon restoration or habitat for fisheries restoration. And all of those ideas, like I said earlier, they generated from the things that tribes said were important to them. And then we took those opportunities and overlapped them where we could on the federal landscape, and then had a successful project. So that's what I would name as an example.
Well, I'd love to invite the committee actually to come down to Mescalero, Ruidoso, and actually see forest stewardship in action. It's actually quite extraordinary. If you go to the line of where Mescalero's boundary is and the Forest Service line and see the forest stewardship that they've done, they were actually able to stop catastrophic fire and flooding in a huge forest fire that's ravaged that mountain last year, and you can literally see it in the landscape through how that stewardship was implemented on the ground. But I would be remiss if I did not use this opportunity to also point out, as I think Ranking Member Neguse did, which is you can't do your job if you don't have resources. And I think Mr. Neguse pointed this out, but I just want to put a finer point on this. President Trump delivered a budget to Congress 3 weeks ago that cuts the Forest Service budget by $1.3 billion. That's a lot of money. And that included $303 million in this program, state and tribal stewardship, and people can't do their jobs if they don't have funding. I'll just say, I know you've been doing this work for a long time. People are struggling out there in our Forest Service. So in addition to doing the best that you can to manage in a chaotic situation, just ask that you continue to support our Forest Service folks on the ground, because they don't know what's going to happen, and we really need folks out there. So appreciate you, and thank you for coming in today. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and I'll recognize the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, for 5 minutes.
I thought it was, okay. Great.
You're next.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Crockett, thank you so much for being here today. I represent a lot of Forest Service land, as well as Oregon has the majority of forest land that the BLM controls. So we have a lot of federal lands, and as you know, we have a patchwork set of management. So literally Forest Service next to tribal managed lands, next to private managed lands, next to state lands. So when a fire starts on or in our federal forests and it comes into our cities, it comes into our tribal managed land, it's an issue. So we really want to make sure that we're working together in how we manage these lands. I think tribal co-management is a means to that end, in that I have the honor of representing 4 of Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes, and I can tell you that their experience in managing forests for millennia would be something that I hope that the Forest Service can take advantage of. However, knowing that wildfire is one of your top priorities, and I agree in that every year we lose more and more acres to forests, and people and homes and species are in danger. But with DOJ's haphazard cuts and the chaos across the federal government, we're going into a fire season without the personnel that we need. The Forest Service recently had 217 probationary staff in Oregon fired because they didn't have fire in their job title. But you well know that we utilize people and bring them from other jobs into work in fighting wildfire and, again, preventing wildfire. These workers have been hired back. They show up to each day not knowing if they're going to be cut again by a reduction in force. And at Oregon State University, some forestry students may not graduate on time because their Forest Service internships have been canceled due to the DOJ hiring freeze. These are foresters that train with the Forest Service so that we can have the people that can go take care of our forests. The program was ended. And then the president's budget calls for eliminating Job Corps, but the Job Corps Civilian Conservation Center in my district helps get youth connected to future careers in forestry by providing training and work opportunities on public lands, and it's critical for filling workforce needs, also an opportunity for struggling youth. I had a Republican state representative in my district call me yesterday to say, what are you doing to help get the funding for the Wolf Creek Job Corps program back? It's really critical, as you know, so I'd love to work with you on that. Heard from small Oregon-based nonprofits who've had their Forest Service grants clawed back. Now they're sidelined, and they're not able to get out into the woods to do the work that we all agree are necessary to keep our community safe and to prevent larger wildfires. I've heard from local scientists that DOJ's $1 credit card limit for federal travel means that Forest Service staff can't go check cameras out in Frontier, Oregon, because it would require them to stay overnight or have a gas card. I want to know what we're going to do to fix that, because it's an issue. And if the Forest Service staff aren't allowed to do their jobs and the hiring pipeline is cut off and nonprofit partners are sidelined, where is the capacity coming from? And what can we do to help you make sure we have the capacity so people in my district don't end up dying in a fire?
So thank you for the question. Let me focus in on one part of it, and that's making sure that we have a ready workforce to be ready to respond to our wildfire season. And we've put an emphasis on that, making sure that, so we actually exempted any fire employee who had was at a GS-10 or below. We exempted them from being able to take one of the workforce reshaping efforts that have happened. And so Congress appropriates the funding for us to hire 11,300 wildland firefighters. And we're taking that funding and well on our way to making sure that we've hired that capacity to be responsive to this wildfire season. So
my question is Job Corps and our internships with our Oregon State students.
Okay, I don't have
Can
the.
I get an answer?
So I don't have the
in writing?
specifics on Job Corps, but look forward to working with you on the follow-up actions for it.
Thank you.
Gentlelady, time has expired, and if there are no further questions, we're going to move on to our third panel. Thank you, Mr. Crockett. We really appreciate your time here today. While the clerk resets our witness table, I will remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. I'd also like to remind our witnesses of the timing lights, which will turn red at the end of your 5-minute statement, and to please remember to turn on your microphone. As with this second panel, I will allow all witnesses to testify before member questioning. Well, terrific. It looks like we have our third panel impaneled, and it's good to have you all here. And first, I will recognize Representative Hoyle to do an introduction of our first witness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm very glad to welcome my constituent, Tim Vredenberg, to the committee today. Mr. Vredenberg graduated from Georgetown College with a degree in environmental science, attended graduate school at Oregon State University, where his area of emphasis was wildlife management and silviculture. Since 2012, he's worked for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians as their Director of Forest Management, and previous to that worked with a number of tribes on forest management and wildlife management. He works to carry out the tribe's effort to manage forest in their ancestral homelands and provide for the cultural and economic well-being for many generations to come. Mr. Vredenberg has extensive knowledge in the issues we're discussing today. I look forward to hearing his testimony on the Forest Act, and I will say that the Cow Creek Tribe of Umpqua Indians have invited us out to visit. Cliff Benson and I share this part of the district, and the ONC lands is the perfect place to see side by side the difference in management from federal lands to tribal lands to private lands.
Mr. Vredenberg, you have 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Nagoose, members of the committee. Thank you for the chance to testify today on behalf of the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Tribe of Indians. I serve as the tribe's Director of Forest Management, and we appreciate the committee's leadership in advancing tribal priorities in forest restoration, wildfire resilience, and self-determination. We want to specifically also thank Chairman Hurd and Ranking Member Huffman for your leadership in prioritizing tribal solutions. The Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Tribe of Indian is a sovereign, federally recognized tribe in southwestern Oregon. Today, the Cow Creek Umpqua manage approximately 49,000 acres of forest land interspersed with neighboring federal lands. These lands are essential to the tribe's culture, its economy, and our community. The bill we're here to discuss today includes provisions that we strongly support: expanded tribal co-management authority, infrastructure demonstration projects, needed reforms to the Tribal Forest Protection Act, and many others. In my work with the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, IFMAT 4, I visited tribal forests across the nation, and one thing became abundantly clear is that tribal forest management is different. Tribes must live with the consequences of their actions. Management decisions are felt immediately and locally. That kind of intimate accountability produces a very different kind of stewardship. Too often, the federal status quo policy treats much of our forests as no-touch zones. This philosophy says that if something's important or sensitive, we draw a line around it and we exclude management. But Indigenous knowledge teaches us something much different. When something's special or important, tribes manage for it. Indigenous management is based on the principle of reciprocity. It's not just about what can be taken from the forest, it's about what must be given back. Management and restoration are our responsibility. If we want clean water, clean air, wood products from our forests, we need to give back supportive management. Timber harvest and fire, when used with purpose and intention, they aren't scary words. They're tools for forest health. Today, we're dealing with the consequences of an exclusion-based forest policy. The result, catastrophic wildfires, degraded water, lost wildlife habitat, and declining biodiversity. Our forests were designed by the Creator to have people tending to them. It's about people. For tribes, revenues from forestry operations support critical government services such as elder care, education, and health care. At Cow Creek Umpqua, our leadership embraces the philosophy that high tides float all boats. Forest health and economic health are inseparable. The Indian Trust Asset Reform Act has shown what's possible when tribes lead. While continuing to meet or exceed all environmental standards, including the ESA, we're restoring forest health, improving wildlife habitat, and bringing fish back. And how do we know? We monitor, we look, we ask questions. At Cow Creek, we've used ITARA to improve efficiency, reduce costs, increase accountability, and manage our forest more effectively. This approach should be scaled and replicated across federal agencies. This isn't a partisan issue. The Bipartisan Wildfire Commission report made a clear recommendation that Congress should authorize USDA to enter into co-management agreements with tribes and share, defer, or transfer decision-making authority. That's exactly what this bill does. We're in the midst of a national forest health and wildfire crisis. Every fire season feels like a waking nightmare. Our families, our children are literally choking on this crisis. We have an opportunity to address it. We keep hearing people say that this is the new normal. We reject that. It doesn't have to be. We have an opportunity through this bill to work together to develop the tools to end the wildfire crisis and restore our nation's forests. The Cow Creek Umpqua and tribal nations stand ready to help. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you.
Questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vredenberg. I now recognize Ms. Sarah Clark, co-lead at the Stewardship Project. Ms. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Naguz, and all members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to offer my perspective on the draft for today's discussion, the Forest Act, introduced by Representative Hurd. My name is Sarah Clark, and I'm a partner at a public interest law firm called Shute Mahali and Weinberger in San Francisco, California. I'm here today as the co-lead of the Stewardship Project, which is a collaboration between scientists and Indigenous practitioners focused on federal forest policy, supported by the Climate and Wildfire Institute. I also served as a subject matter expert for the Bipartisan Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission, and one of my other co-leads, Scott Stevens, served as an appointed commissioner. We started the Stewardship Project because, as Mr. Vandenberg said, our wildlands are in crisis. Both scientists and Indigenous practitioners know that these places evolved with human care. Removal of beneficial fire and other stewardship techniques have left wildlands vulnerable to catastrophic wildfire and disease and have made our communities less safe. The Stewardship Project brings these voices together to advance sound forest policy. There are many examples of the ways that our current policy framework has led to this crisis, but I wanted to highlight one for you today. In 2020, up in Northern California, the Slater fire burned over 150,000 acres and claimed 2 lives. Local tribes and community members had advocated for years to return more beneficial fire and other management techniques to the landscape, but it hadn't happened. If you visit the area today, much of it is a complete moonscape. Looking across multiple ridges, all you can see is standing dead timber with head-high brush and invasive species. Significant and active work is needed to put this landscape on the path towards recovery and to protect the tribal communities along the Klamath River. However, it took the Forest Service almost 5 years to even begin the NEPA process to bring back beneficial fire and other stewardship to this landscape. In the intervening years, restoration work has become more difficult and recurrent wildfire risk has increased. The Karuk tribe and others in the Western Klamath Regional Partnership have urged the Forest Service to begin work. However, it's clear that they need additional help to do so. This is why we need common sense legislation like the Forests Act. It will allow tribes to manage their ancestral homelands based on experience and knowledge passed down since time immemorial. And if adequately resourced, it will provide federal land management agencies with willing and able partners at a time when their capacity is severely hampered. The Stewardship Project is particularly excited that Section 2 of the proposed legislation would allow federal land management agencies to designate places as Indian forest lands. I want to clarify, we don't believe this is a transfer of land to the BIA into trust, but instead a specific designation that would allow tribes to apply the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act to these areas. This designation would then bring in tribes as true partners to take on the role of planning for and implementing projects that are necessary to bring balance to their landscapes. The Karuk tribe, for instance, could adopt a tribal integrated resource management plan within the footprint of the Slater fire on both tribal trust land and Forest Service land and start to bring Indigenous knowledge to the forefront of restoring this heavily impacted landscape. We also see significant value in the legislation's proposed changes to the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which currently offers one of the clearest paths for tribes interested in implementing forest health projects near their reservations. While the TFPA has been used effectively across the United States, tribes still have a hard time getting the Forest Service to respond in a timely manner. We also want to offer a few suggestions to help build on the draft's strong foundations. First, we recommend that existing forest and land management plans are properly coordinated with any planning efforts undertaken by tribes, with clarity to the agencies on how to do that coordination effectively. Second, we want to make sure that by importing the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act onto Forest Service lands, we don't end up with a project approval process that is overly cumbersome. And third, any new authorities related to cultural burning should not infringe on tribal sovereignty, and instead ensure that agencies can accommodate this cultural practice on federally administered lands in a way that respects Indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief systems. Finally, we see a huge opportunity to coordinate the Forest Act with Representative Huffman's Tribal Co-Management and Self-Determination in Forestry Act. Taken together, we believe these two bills could provide significant additional flexibility and new authority, especially to the Forest Service. The capacity, resources, and needs of tribes are very different across the United States, so it's important to make sure we don't offer a one-size-fits-all solution. Tribes and agencies need flexibility to act quickly and get the work done. These two bills would open the door to tribes helping significantly with the stewardship of federally administered lands. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. I now recognize Mr. Austin Lowe's, Tribal Chairman of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Chairman Lowe's, welcome, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, miigwech. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Austin Lowe's, and I serve as the chairman of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. We are the largest federally recognized tribe east of the Mississippi River with more than 53,000 members, and we're also a signatory to the 1836 Treaty of Washington. The 1836 treaty ceded more than 26 million acres of land and water to the United States in exchange for goods and services, while also reserving our right to hunt, fish, and gather on those lands and waters. Those rights remain legally binding to this day. Our people have exercised these rights for generations, continuing to harvest food, medicine, and materials essential to our lifeways and our cultural identity. These rights are foundational to our sovereignty, our way of life, and the Constitution of the United States. As a result of historical land disposition and the unique circumstances of our federal recognition, the Sioux Tribe holds less than 3,000 acres of forest land. This means that almost all treaty-protected harvest and stewardship occurs on lands managed by federal and state agencies. Based on our 2012 Integrated Resource Management Planning Survey of Sioux Tribe members, we estimate that our members harvest over 1 million meals per year in the 1836 ceded territory, and more than half of our members rely on national forests for subsistence. These lands are not simply recreational. They are foundational to our food sovereignty, our economic security, and our cultural survival. Today, management of ceded lands and waters occurs collaboratively with 4 other 1836 treaty signatory tribes, the United States and the state of Michigan under the 2006 U.S. Forest Service MOU, the 2007 Inland Consent Decree, and the 2023 Great Lakes Consent Decree. The Sioux Tribe asserts that along with the right to harvest plants and animals codified within the consent decrees, the tribal, federal, and state governments have reciprocal responsibilities to these plants and animals, as well as the larger ecological system in which they live and interact. To fulfill our responsibility as Ojibwe people and to effect forest stewardship on ceded lands, the Sioux Tribe has invested millions of tribal dollars in rebuilding our capacity and establishing necessary tribal-federal partnerships for managing these lands. Since 2012, we have secured over 20 grant-funded projects with U.S. Forest Service staff as collaborators. We've used these funds to build professional capacity to hire tribal scientists, to conduct ecological research, and to co-develop fire, silviculture, and wildlife strategies within the Forest Service. Despite these successes, establishing co-management in practice has been an uphill battle. We have encountered significant barriers due to the lack of sustained financial resources, limited human capacity within both tribal and federal agencies, and uncertain co-management infrastructure. There's often little institutional knowledge about how to implement co-management tools and authorities, such as those under the Tribal Forest Protection Act. In addition, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act are frequently misunderstood or inconsistently or narrowly interpreted. Recent drastic changes in the federal workforce have further complicated our efforts. As experienced agency staff retire or are about to be reassigned, we've encountered growing institutional uncertainty about existing agreements and commitments. Despite securing competitive funding, we have faced delays and rescoping of approved projects due to shifts in personnel and agency priorities. In some cases, even previously obligated funding has come under reconsideration, which undermines trust and continuity. The Forest Act provides critical tools for expanding tribal leadership and forest management. It amends the Tribal Forest Protection Act to allow tribes to propose projects on culturally significant lands beyond those directly adjacent to their reservations. It also authorizes tribes to lead prescribed and cultural burns, establishes demonstration projects for biochar and restoration activities, allows tribes to propose treating certain federal lands as Indian forest lands for planning and stewardship purposes, and mandates timely agency reviews for proposals. So I finally reached my conclusion, which is this. The Sioux Tribe has walked an uphill battle to co-management. We built programs, trained staff, and invested in science and culture, along with showing that tribal-led conservation is not only effective, but also award-winning. But we cannot do it alone. Congress must act to embed tribal co-stewardship in the fabric of federal forest management. The Forest Act offers that opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman Lowe's. I now like to recognize Mr. Cody Desatel, President of the Intertribal Timber Council and Executive Director of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Mr. Desautels, welcome back, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany and members of the committee. I'm Cody Desautels, and I serve as the president of the Intertribal Timber Council and also as the executive director for the Colville Tribe in North Central Washington State. On behalf of the ITC and its more than 60 member tribes, I appreciate this opportunity to testify in support of the Forest Act. I want to start by thanking this committee for your continued focus and attention to Indian forestry. Your leadership recognizes that the unique role tribes play in forest stewardship is critical to overcoming the growing threats to our forests and natural resources. When Congress, tribes, state and federal agencies work together, we create a force multiplier effect that drives lasting results across our landscapes. However, to achieve these results, funding and staffing resources must be shared equitably across all partners as well. Section 2 would authorize the Forest Service and BLM to enter into management agreements with the tribes. Treating federal forests as Indian forest land simply means that tribes are able to use existing federal laws and regulations that apply to Indian forests. The National Indian Forest Resource Management Act, or NFIRMA, is one example. NFIRMA is the most modern of any federal forest management statute and requires compliance with all applicable federal laws, such as NEPA, ESA, and others. It also requires independent scientific review once every 10 years, with a report of those findings to Congress. The Forest Act replicates that tribal approach to federal lands with sideboards similar to current federal laws that include maintaining public access, competitive sale of commercial timber, and revenue sharing with local jurisdictions. The Indian Trust Asset Reform Act demonstration project is an important tool that is being successfully used by tribes to reduce administrative costs and improve timelines of forest management projects. However, the authority expires next year and should be permanently reauthorized by either congressional action or administrative authority granted to the Secretary of Interior. Ultimately, Congressman Hurd's legislation is a response to growing frustration from tribes that we aren't making adequate progress on federal lands. The ITC believes the authority proposed in the Forest Act would be the logical next step for tribal co-management and would benefit all Americans. The Forest Act also extends authorization of the Tribal Biomass Demonstration Project. This could make projects conducted under Section 2 more economically viable by providing uses for small diameter material, which would also align well with the new biochar demonstration project described in Section 4. The biomass demonstration also directs the management plans on affected federal lands to be aligned with tribal resource management plans, similar to an existing provision within the National Forest Management Act. Section 5 creates a tribal prescribed and cultural burn demonstration project, which would provide tribes with the flexibility to conduct prescribed or cultural burns when conditions were appropriate and consistent with approved burn plans. This pilot authority would increase the number of acres available during burn windows, which should increase the total accomplishments for tribes and federal agencies for that matter. Section 6 requires federal agencies to respond to TFPA proposals within 120 days and provides a deemed approved mechanism if tribes don't receive a response. This would ensure projects are approved and implemented in a timely manner consistent with the urgency to reduce fire risk and post-fire impacts. Section 7 and 8 creates an Indian sawmill infrastructure demonstration project to expedite removal of dead wood or hazardous fuels in high-risk fire sheds on federal land. Sawmill infrastructure provides multiple benefits, including jobs for local rural communities, revenue to support additional restoration work, and ensures biomass removed is processed into value-added products. Section 9 provides a full fix to the Good Neighbor Authority to allow tribes full participation in that program. While this issue may have been addressed in the Explorer Act, we want to ensure Congress's intent is explicit. Section 11 requires a report to Congress from the Department of Agriculture and Interior regarding the pay rates for tribal firefighters. While the department has gone to great lengths to ensure tribal firefighters are treated similarly, we want to ensure that parity is maintained through time. The ITC appreciates the bipartisan support for the Tribal Co-Management Authority of Federal Forests. We also want to acknowledge and support the work done by Representative Huffman to codify tribal co-management into federal decision-making and would include the integration of Indigenous knowledge. We see Mr. Huffman's bill as complementary to the Forest Act and recommend its consideration by this committee. We appreciate the committee's continued interest and support of our partnership with federal agencies, and thank you for inviting us and my colleagues to testify on the bill today, and we stand ready for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Desautels. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions. And first, I want to turn to the chairman of the committee, Mr. Westerman. You get to go first.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Very important subject that we're having this hearing on. And Mr. Vredenberg, I appreciated your testimony, discussion about how tribes approach forest management. I've always said that there is no such thing as no action in forest management. A decision not to manage is a management decision. And we've seen the results of those bad management decisions across the country. Can you talk a little bit further about how this isn't a mutually exclusive proposition, that you either have good environmental stewardship or you have a healthy economy, but how actually having environmental conservation stewardship plays into having a better economy and how that plays out on tribal lands?
What a relief you didn't ask me to calculate basal area.
We can talk about that if you want.
I know. Tribes manage, tribal management's more outcome-based. Yes, it is, the management does produce revenue, and the revenue is important for essential government services for the tribe. But the approach is very different, as I mentioned, from a traditional conservation approach. Indigenous conservation approaches are managing for values rather than excluding management. The outcome, for example, at Cow Creek, our water quality standard is clean, cold water leaving the reservation. It doesn't matter what the protection buffer width should be if it's not getting that done. And so in the case of Cow Creek, that outcome has to happen. And there's no compromise. So,
yeah.
And I see that across Indian country when we visit other tribes.
And I know you testified on the Senate hearing on the Fix Our Forest Act and had some suggestions on how to improve some of the provisions in the Fix Our Forest Act. Would you care to explain on those ideas and how FOFA is actually complementary to the authorities in the Forest Act?
Yeah, there's just, the Forest Service has really talented, smart, caring people, but the bureaucracy has grown over the years to a crippling tipping point that it now takes years to accomplish a categorical exclusion, and those small categorical exclusions don't allow us to address the mountains of problems that we're facing to address the wildfire crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Desautels, good to see you. Thank you for being here again. The Forest Act contains provision that expands pilots for tribal biomass and tribal biochar projects. What environmental and economic benefits would there be for tribes for increasing the use of biomass and biochar?
Thank you, Chairman Westerman. Great to see you again. I think there's two opportunities there. One, from a risk management perspective, by finding and developing markets for those two products, it gives an economically viable way to get that material out of the woods. It reduces field loadings that would reduce the future impacts of fires. In addition to that, on the economic side, by providing an economic value for that product, it gives us the ability to do more work, more restoration work on the landscape through time. That much of the work we do is funding limited. So if we can generate revenue from those forest products, it allows us to accomplish those land management goals and objectives faster.
Yeah, and Ms. Clark, had I been here to give my opening statement, which I apologize for, I would have talked about how for millennia tribes managed the forest, and they were in great shape until European settlers came along and overcut and stopped burning and really messed things up, to put it in a nice way. and now we have forests that are overstocked and unhealthy. And, you know, tribes are bearing the brunt of the poor management, but let's talk about how we can get back to better management and how the Forest Act can help return safe and beneficial thinning and burning to our forest.
Thank you for the question. I agree. And for me, the main provision in the Forest Act that I think would do that is Section 2, which allows for this designation of federally administered lands as Indian lands. And that would allow tribes to step in and use their traditional ecological knowledge in the planning and management of forest activities. And I think, as you alluded to, so much of what we see on our landscape today is because we've had the exclusion of those practices, and we're applying systems of knowledge that don't work with the ecosystems. And the Forest Act, I think, would really encourage tribes to step into a leadership role.
Thank you. A lot more questions, but not enough time. I yield back.
Gentlemen, time has expired, and I now turn to the lady from New Mexico for 5 minutes of questioning.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We should have named him Bernie.
Oh, the good people out there couldn't hear me defending the honor of Smokey Bear. So I'm going to say it again. I thought the chairman was coming for Smokey the Bear, who is from New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. But what he's referring to is fire suppression, which for the last half century has left our forests in a mess in terms of stewardship and stopping fires and catastrophic impacts from these fires. And so I'm grateful, as I said during the last panel, for this bipartisan effort to ensure that tribes are not only co-stewards, but actually stewards of the lands that are not only within their own jurisdictional boundaries, but also on lands that are currently under federal jurisdiction. But I want to use this opportunity, since we have so many wonderful guests with us who've traveled from across the country, to hear from you a little bit more. And I'd like to start with Chairman Lowe's. You know, one of the things that we're hearing in New Mexico from tribes is that there actually has been funding freezes that are impacting forest stewardship. At Mescalero Apache, they had a BIA forest stewardship contract that was going to be very important for replanting areas that had been significantly damaged by some of the last forests. And so I wonder if you could share with us what impacts, if any, you're seeing on the ground in Michigan in terms of funding freezes, staffing reductions and chaos, and the proposed budget, both for Forest Service and BIA and other programs that you guys contract for.
Yeah, I appreciate your question. So we have seen an impact. We co-manage the Hiawatha National Forest with the U.S. Forest Service. It's comprised of about 800,000 square acres. As far as the impact that we've seen, you know, when there's staffing cuts, when there's forced retirements, when there's reassignments, the partners that we work with for the Hemi-Boreal project, we're starting with new people, and it just delays things. So it's unfortunate, but we're doing our best to work through it.
And I know one of the big concerns that we're also hearing about in New Mexico is that even though this isn't USDA/Forest Service, it's a Department of Interior, has issued a consultation call on reorganization of BIA and to consolidate the current BIA district offices in half. And I think folks need to really understand that working in a nation-to-nation capacity with our tribes requires having boots on the ground. You have to have federal folks actually go visit with tribal councils and leaders to cut deals, do contracts, get stuff done. I wonder, I know you guys aren't here to testify on that specifically, but to the extent that you're able to, if we could just go down the line, if there's any additional information in the remaining time you'd like to share that we should be conscious of in terms of working with the administration to try to make the situation better in tribal consultation, would love to hear from you. So why don't we start here on the end?
Sure. We see the, you know, this moment where we're at as an opportunity for greater partnership, that there is a recognized need, but that with that comes opportunity for new relationships and new kinds of relationships. So we're remain optimistic as we move forward.
Ms. Clark?
I agree with your statement that adequate consultation and adequate partnership requires people on the ground on both sides. And I would say that one of the things that is really important is making sure that folks in federal agencies have the knowledge and training and history with the tribes that they are working with. It is not simply having someone show up in a meeting space that's there to represent the federal government, but someone that knows anything about federal Indian law, knows about the people that they are there to negotiate and discuss with. And so having that longevity in positions is really critical.
Really appreciate that. Yep.
So the instability that we're seeing with this administration is causing chaos, for lack of a better word. So at the beginning of the year, we got notification that the IHS Sanitation Office in Sault Ste. Marie, along with the local BIA offices, were going to have lease cancellations. We called employees within those offices. They had no idea what was going on. And that's important because if those offices close, it impacts us. So fast forward a couple months, those offices aren't closing, but that lack of transparency has a definite impact on our operations.
And the only thing I would add quickly is that we've got to have that administrative support for the federal government as well. So if we don't have folks in BIA central office that are processing feds, that are reviewing contracts, those same functions at the regional offices, that's the delays we've seen at Cawbill. It hasn't necessarily been because funding's been cut. We don't have people to process and move that money to the tribes.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you all for being here and for traveling and coming and testifying, and I look forward to working with my friends across the aisle to try to address some of these issues. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for all of your testimony today. Chairman Lowes, where's your hometown? Where were you born?
Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan.
Where's that?
The very northern tip of the Upper Peninsula on the Canadian border.
Where'd you go to school at?
I earned my undergraduate degree from Lake Superior State University and my master's degree from Michigan State.
If I may interject, Mr. Lowe's, he's setting you up, just so you understand.
You gave it away.
He gave it away?
What year did Lake Superior State University win its first national championship?
Oh, God, I'm not a good Laker. I'm probably the only person in
Chairman Lowe's, that's on my championship ring here.
Oh, geez.
1988.
I was going to say the year I was born, 1988. I'm dating myself.
Now you're making me feel old.
It's a lucky year, sir.
Listen, I'm glad you're here. I really appreciate your comments. Lake Superior State was a great university. I went there from 86 to 90, won a national championship. It was a special place. Upper Peninsula is a special place, and you're doing a wonderful job. So I really appreciate you traveling to our nation's capital. And as you move forward, I wish you luck. I knew Aaron Payment. We went to school together at Lake State. He was a runner, cross-country runner. So I really appreciate you being here. With that being said, Mr. Vandenberg, in your testimony, you note that, quote, Western conservation models treat sensitive areas as no-touch zones, closing them off from any human attendance or management, and further discuss how Indigenous communities' approaches are often different and involve active management. Can you expand upon this? How is this passive approach failing our proper forest management?
Sure, that's a great question. When we identify areas to protect, I mean, the intention is well, but what inevitably happens is the lack of management. Those areas become overgrown, overstocked, and then eventually develop severe fire risk. And in the end, we often lose them to wildfire. And if not to wildfire, they're a biological desert on the floor because there's no sunlight. So we're losing, those important things that, the intention was to protect them, but the very act and approach is undermining that intention.
And I think that you bring the mention of wildfires. Currently, my district in northeastern Minnesota, we've got 3 wildfires going right now, and it's just unbelievable. I'm proud of the Forest Service. I'm proud of the volunteers. I'm proud of the firefighters, the community, the counties involved. It's unfortunate that we have to have a disaster like that to see that human spirit survive, but I'm very proud of how the way we're handling it. We face issues in our district with forest management, which includes the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness within the Superior National Forest, which is a working national forest where timber harvesting and mining are desired conditions. Every day we fight with some people that don't want us to be there. They want to completely shut off the boundary waters from any human access, be it for responsible recreation or forest management. And we have serious concerns that this could lead to devastating impacts the next time a forest fire rolls through. Passive management is putting our forests at risk, as you just said. Mr. DeSantel, in your testimony, you discussed the potential economic impact Rep. Hurd's legislation would have on Indian country. And you make specific mention of the Indian Sawmill Infrastructure Demonstration Project, including the 20-year stewardship agreements or contracts tribes would be able to enter into with federal land managers. Can you speak a bit more about the utility of these long-term contracting and stewardship authorities?
Sure. The big problem with reestablishing infrastructure once it's been lost is it's really expensive. So, I mean, if you look at the current day cost to establish a new sawmill, it's probably north of $100 million. So to secure that type of financing from an institution, you need to have a long-term guaranteed log supply agreement so they have confidence that you can repay your debt over that time frame. So I think that's the most critical component of it. And what that infrastructure provides you from a management perspective is it gives you value for those forest products that you're removing. And the analysis I always use, or the analogy I use for Cawville, is that really logs and funding from logs isn't our most important goal. That's really those ecosystem functions. It's really a byproduct of our management, but it provides funding.
And that consistency and length of contract will bring investments to the community, and our tribal neighbors will see that, and they will take part, and that's an economic benefit. It's a win-win. Would you agree with that?
I would, and for us, it's not just to the tribal community. The logs that our mills go to now are our local communities off the reservation as well, so it benefits the northeast region of the state, not just the reservation.
You're exactly right. Mr. Chair, before I end, Lake Superior State University. Now yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. So why did your kid go to Michigan Tech then?
He was a better player than I was.
I know, I'll recognize the gentlelady from Oregon for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I do have to say, my husband went to Michigan State as well, so it's really awkward when they play the Ducks. Other than that, it all works out. I appreciate this panel, and thanks for the witnesses, especially y'all from the West Coast for traveling all this way. I've met with many of you and your tribal leadership on many occasions to discuss the importance of forest management, now certainly in Central and Southwest Oregon, but also across the West. I think, Mr. Redenberg, you could talk about what the Cow Creek tribe lost 10,000 acres last year because of a fire that started on federal lands. And again, 99% of BLM forest lands are in Oregon. And then we have this patchwork set of management. So even if you're managing your property, your lands, you can't stop the fire from coming over. So having consistency in land management would be, it would be a blessing. But I think specifically, I'll ask you and anyone else that wants to come in to discuss the challenges you're currently facing, preventing you from doing the co-management work, and then maybe touch on how the timber receipts work or don't work in getting those back. I know we lost 5 mills in my district last year, so having some consistency in supply, also, preserving old growth. We can do both at the same time.
First, thank you for your kind introduction earlier. We can have both. As other panelists stated, this is oftentimes the logs are the outcome. It's as we apply an approach through the Indigenous lens, we'll as we focus on the outcomes rather than how we get there, it really leads us in a different approach. And that's the rub, as I'm trying to formulate. It's a tough question. You know, we look at tribal management and it works really well. It's beautiful. It's getting the work done. And so we invite tribes into the federal land space to do that work, but we haven't changed any of the rules that are causing, you know, the federal agencies to fail. And so that's a rub. It's not only a different philosophy and approach to conservation, where you know, tribes are more proactive stewardship kind of style. It's the barriers that have hindered the Forest Service, you know, for decades now are still there. We haven't addressed those. So that's what this bill really addresses.
You pointing at me?
Yes, I'm pointing, I'm trying to,
Okay.
either one of you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So regarding the tribal side of the challenges with cold management, there's a couple issues. Number one is limited capacity on both sides to sustain complex agreements. You know, fragmented funding makes long-term planning quite difficult. Lack of familiarity with existing tools such as the Tribal Forest Protection Act and the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Those are barriers. And finally, delayed and inconsistent agency engagement, particularly with staff turnover.
Not much to add to that, but to maybe give where there's positive examples around the country, it's where there's that consistent source of funding and staffing so that those relationships get built and maintained through time. Because it seems like where there's a personal trust between both agency staff and tribal staff, we seem to be getting good work done on the ground.
I would agree with that. And I'd like to thank Representative Huffman, Representative Hurd, and Chairman Westerman for their work on today's bill to address these challenges. And what I want more than anything is for us to be able to get this going in the next year, so it's not just something that we're talking about at a committee while we're contemplating what could be. We actually have to get this happening on the ground because we don't have the capacity to deal with wildfire right now, and I think this is an elegant solution.
Before you yield, Ms. Clark, did you want to respond to the question that Ms. Hoyle?
Thank you. I'll just add one thing briefly. You spoke about the need for cross-boundary work, and I wanted to highlight that in the Forest Act, I think that's one of its key benefits, is that it allows for cross-boundary planning between tribal trust lands, reservation lands, and lands that are administered by federal agencies in a way that, frankly, we don't have in any of our existing statutory authorities. And so I think that's a huge benefit, and one of the things that we really do struggle with, because fire, forest health doesn't know boundaries.
Thank you so much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Now I'll recognize another Oregonian, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome all of you here. I guess that one of the biggest issues, and I noticed in reviewing Mr. Crockett's testimony that he was sensitive to the challenges that are going to go with this kind of a management arrangement. And so I spent some time going through the bill and trying to sort out what the foundation would be for determining who's in charge. And you could tell that from my earlier questions. So I'm looking at this bill and trying to figure out a simple thing to focus upon that would raise the issue. And the easy one is found on page 3 of the bill, where there's the discussion of access and who controls it. And so just to point out, by the way, I want it clear, I think the tribes are the key to getting into this land and taking care of it. So what I'm saying now is in the order of trying to make this thing actually work. And I can't think of anything that would destroy it more quickly than a belief by folks, hunters and others, that somehow this arrangement would prevent them from having access. This would not advance 1 inch if that were the case. So drawing your attention to page 3 of the bill, I note that it says, as part of the agreement to treat federal forest land as Indian forest land, under paragraph 1, the secretary concerned and the tribe making the request shall. And then it says to the maximum extent practicable. Then it says, and this is the language that is a bit of a problem, I think, subject to any Indian Trust Asset Management Plan approved under Section 204 of the Indian Trust Asset Management and Demonstration Act. Well, I have it right here. I looked it up, and I was trying to figure out where the public would have something to say about what the contents of that agreement might be. This bill needs a lot of work. It's not as clearly crafted as it should be, and it's a draft, right? So the real question is, if folks, the public, don't have an opportunity to weigh in putting together the agreement that provides the exception to access, then we have a problem. So I'll start with you, Mr. Vandenberg. What is your thought when it comes to the access by the public to land being managed by the tribe under one of these agreements?
I completely agree. You know, that has to be addressed. ITARA does require that the public has, is informed and has the ability to comment. And I think what we would need to recognize is if we were to amend our ITAMP, Indian Trust Asset Management Plan, to include the federal lands, the public changes. Instead of on reservation where it's a tribal public, now that public needs to be interpreted more broadly to include the general public. And those lands need to be managed for the public benefit as well, which means access, recreation, the things we all value.
I note in regard to how they have to be managed, if you go to page 9 of the bill, and a very inartfully crafted paragraph from lines 1 down to line 9, it says that, I think it's saying that the tribe shall be the sole authority for timber management activities on these lands. It's not written clearly enough to know whether that's what's meant, but is that your thought, that the tribe would be the, quote, sole authority for timber management activities on those lands?
That's how I read it. And I think we can do a better job as far as using modern techniques for marketing, ensuring competitive bids for the material that comes off of those restoration projects that will fund future work. We're positioned to be able to do that very effectively.
I believe you. The challenge is going to be making sure that all the neighbors, in all which we would hope would be large parcels of land, all of which need these management activities, are enthusiastic about the arrangement and not opposing it. And so the bill needs considerable clarification to make sure that these access issues are addressed. And I've been working on this, obviously, down in my part of the state of Oregon, where there are no trees when it comes to access to huge millions of acres of rangeland, and access is everything to everybody. So with that, I'm happy for your efforts here, and look forward to working with you to help clear it up. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to take my time for questioning. I want to start with you, Mr. Desautels. Thank you for coming back again. We had testimony that you mentioned, in your testimony, you mentioned 2023, a project that a preservationist NGO sued that stopped years of collaboration between the tribe and the Forest Service. From your perspective, what effect does this litigation have on the Forest Service and how it interferes with the ability to be able to collaborate and work together?
So it was the Stamp Oil project, the TFPA proposal that we submitted, I think, back in 2014. So it took almost a decade to get to a decision, which was ultimately litigated by the Kettle Range Conservancy, and the Forest Service lost. Unfortunately, we were not called to be amicus brief or otherwise incorporated into the litigation, which is unfortunate. But what we've seen from the Colville National Forest since is there seems to be a reluctance to do additional work. That part of the state had gone almost 2 decades without a forest management project being litigated, and now they've slowed considerably. So the scope of that project was subsequently reduced significantly to fall under a categorical exclusion, but we still have significant concerns that the forest and fire risks associated with that project that has like 20 miles of adjacent boundary with the reservation won't have the level of treatment that we think it needs to reduce that risk.
So it didn't eliminate the treatment, but it severely crimped it? Would that be accurate?
Well, and we'll see if the categorical exclusion gets to the finish line, but that's how they've reapproached it. After they lost the litigation, they rescoped the project to be significantly smaller, significantly less timber harvest, significantly less prescribed fire, so that it would fall under a categorical exclusion. And again, we'll see if that gets to implementation or not. It's yet to be determined.
I took, Mr. Vredenberg, from your testimony that perhaps these are my words, but you view a categorical exclusion at this point as a Band-Aid for what should be more comprehensive management. Am I saying that accurately?
No.
Go ahead and say it in your words.
I guess, yes.
Specifically in regards to a categorical exclusion.
I guess you, Chairman, you are correct. It is somewhat of a Band-Aid. The NEPA process for has become really so cumbersome that we're relying more on categorical exclusions for lower intensity, more routine maintenance projects, because environmental assessments or environmental impact statements have gotten so incredibly expensive. And so, yes, in a sense, they are a Band-Aid.
Would you say that, because this comes up regularly here in this committee in regards to NEPA, that perhaps there needs to be some changes made to NEPA?
Yeah, the focus is drifted from analyzing the real environmental impacts and doing a good job of communicating those impacts to the public. That's the intent of NEPA. They've become more like legal documents that have to, every document that's written, it has to stand the rigors of court, of litigation. And so it really has lost its way, I think, in that regard.
Ms. Clark, would you agree with that assessment?
I would like to highlight the difficulties that NEPA places, especially with the use of beneficial fire. And so, as we know, beneficial fire, use of prescribed fire in particular, is a really important management technique. And many prescribed fire projects have been caught up in NEPA analysis that have delayed and increased costs and suffered litigation risk. But we haven't done any study of fire exclusion. And so we engage in fire suppression, we engage in the exclusion of cultural burning and of active fire use on the ground. That itself has huge environmental consequences. Much of the reasons why we see an increase in the high severity catastrophic wildfire is because we have for so long let these low controlled burns not happen on the ground. And so I think NEPA is creating a disincentive to really good forest management activities and letting some of the other consequences of fire suppression and fire exclusion go unexamined.
Is the reduction of mills, as has been documented, is that a problem?
Absolutely. When we're looking at what to do with, as Mr. Desatel said, what to do with the stuff that comes out of the forest. And so in California, we have certainly seen the closure of a number of mills, and that has led to a lack of capacity to handle biomass and other treatments coming out of mechanical thinning. I think in some of the materials, the Washoe tribe's recent mill reopening, for that reason, has been a huge success and a huge piece of excitement for the folks and tribes that work in that area to have that additional capacity.
Yeah, I would just want to turn back to this chart I had up originally. I think this tells the story of forest management, in particular in the western states, but even in my state of Wisconsin, where we've seen mills close, and because of the lack of long-term supply. I mean, it's very clear what's happening with those lines as we've went from less active management of our forests, we've seen more fire. as simple as that. Now, there's going to be some debate about exactly what that looks like in terms of how we go about the management, but regardless, we need management. Isn't that correct, Ms. Clark?
Yes, absolutely. The stewardship project was put together specifically because we know we need to be doing more active work on the ground.
Go ahead, Mr. Desatel.
If I could, Chairman Tiffany, I think your graph is a great illustration of the biggest problem I see with NEPA, that for the entirety of my career, we've evaluated the no impact alternative, the no action alternative as having no impacts. And that's absolutely not the case. I mean, your graph is a great demonstration of that. That I think in most situations, the no action alternative probably has the highest environmental impacts, but we're not treating it that way.
Mr. Lowe's, last session of Congress and under the previous administration, there was an action taken by the administration with the Alaska tribes where they did not consult with some of the tribes in regards to, I think it was in particular, it was in regards to natural resources utilization. I think it was primarily in regards to oil exploration, where the previous administration did not consult with a few of the tribes in Alaska. Is that appropriate?
It's not appropriate. We feel like consultation is vital, and not just any form of consultation, but meaningful consultation where boxes just aren't being checked by meeting with us.
Thank you. So I would just close. I think what you're talking about in terms of, as I see the big picture, this really dovetails into a great opportunity for the United States of America. When you see the whole discussion of let's get regulatory right. I mean, we talked about NEPA, right? And we see the tariffs issue that's out there, that we want to produce things in America once again, that we bring mills and factories back to America. It just seems to me like this is a golden opportunity to do some of that once again in America, where we help produce those affordable 2x4s that go into a house, that make it an affordable house that young people can live in once again. And to me, it all ties together in terms of manufacturing in America to make affordable housing and so many of the good things that can happen for America. I just think that this is a piece of it. While it's a small piece, it's an important piece of how we get there to once again have made in America and to have America prosper once again, including bringing down inflation and all those good things like that. So anyhow, thank you so much for taking the time to come here today. We really appreciate it. And members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we will ask that you respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the subcommittee must submit those questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, May 23rd, 2025, this Friday. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. And if there is no further business, without objection, Subcommittee on Federal Lands stands adjourned.